Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of our podcast, Good Law, Bad Law. I'm the host, Aaron Freiwald, and I'm also the managing partner at Freiwald Law in Philadelphia. And as you know, on this podcast, we talk about the law and why the law matters. And since we're based in Philadelphia, we're going to talk today about the law of criminal justice and the politics surrounding the district attorney's office in Philadelphia. Always a subject of great controversy and even scandal. And to talk with me about this today is someone who knows an awful lot about it, my friend and criminal defense attorney, Alan Tauber. Alan, thank you so much for being on the show.
A pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Well, and that's good because that's what we do. And we're going to keep it conversational. And we are going to talk today about two district attorneys in Philadelphia. And, we always have colorful characters coming out of the district attorney's office in Philadelphia. We've had, all the way back to Arlen Specter, who was district attorney here before. He was a United States Senator, and Lynn Abraham, you and I were talking before we started, and other very colorful characters and a fair share of scandal and controversy and corruption in Philadelphia politics. And most recently, the story of the now jailed district attorney, inmate 75926-066, otherwise known as Seth Williams. I thought it would be great to try to just, tell that story, which you know intimately, what happened to this guy, the rise and fall of Seth Williams, and that leading to the rise of the presumptive district attorney who will, take office after he is anointed, in the coming election this fall, and what Larry Krasner as the new district attorney is going to mean to Philadelphia. And so we've got a rich topic here today, but we were talking before, and it is so fascinating. Maybe you could just sort of walk us through a little bit Seth Williams's fall, his downfall. What happened to this guy?
Well, Seth, he came into office with a great fanfare. There was great prospect for reform in the office. He was replacing Lynn Abraham, who'd been in
forever.
For many, many, many years. And there was a lot of hope and belief that he was going to come in and do some new and interesting things. He did some things. In the end, my opinion, he tended to be along the lines of the way he thought along the lines of the way the office had been traditionally run, the way crimes have been prosecuted. There weren't any great momentous changes. I think also when he came into office, there was a great expectation that he had a very bright political future, that much like the district attorneys of past in Philadelphia, this was just a starting point for him. Ed Rendell became the governor.
Right.
Ron Castillo became the chief judge of the Supreme Court. Arlen Specter is a senator. I mean, it is very much the AAA team had been for the Democratic Party. The Arlen Specter obviously was a Republican, as was Castillo.
And I know you love baseball, so that's a very apt baseball reference.
Right.
So it's a minor league position, but often leads to the big leagues.
Right. I mean, the office, you get a lot of credibility being a prosecutor for all the obvious reasons. And Seth had amazing political gifts. And to spend any time with him, you see that, you understand why. He was very magnetic. He was a very appealing person. And he had a good understanding of what, what the experience is for people in Philadelphia, people who were victims of crime and so forth.
Before you go on with his story, because I say you're someone who knows something about all this, but explain to everybody what you do and where you work as a lawyer and how it is that you know so much about this whole topic that we're going to talk about today.
So I'm a criminal defense attorney. I do civil rights work as well. I started at this as a public defender in 1996. I believe Seth was a line DA. He had been in the office for about a year or two, actually, at that point. I'm sure I tried cases against him. I don't have a specific memory, but he was there as a line DA for a couple of years. It was obvious he had higher ambition. So I was a public defender for 4 years. Went into private practice after that. I've been in private practice in criminal defense and civil rights since 2000.
And what are some of the when you say civil rights, what are some of the kinds of cases that you've handled over the years?
Predominantly, the types of civil rights cases I handle involve abuse or unreasonable actions by the government, as opposed to police misconduct, malicious prosecution, false arrest, excessive force cases. I've done First Amendment retaliation cases where someone has served as a witness or been outspoken, and as the government has taken action to retaliate against persons in those situations. That is a sort of natural offshoot of doing criminal defense. You find people whose rights have been, trampled by the police, typically, and sometimes by the prosecutors. And when they become free of criminal liability, they get to sort of turn the table and then make the government the defendant for what's happened to them. So I've been doing that hand in hand for about the past 17 years.
Okay.
And my practice is predominantly Philadelphia. So I have a lot of experience dealing with the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office, the Solicitor's Office, and sort of the culture of the criminal justice system here. I also have experience outside in the surrounding counties, so which paints a very stark contrast. Philadelphia is often known as the exception to all the rules. It's no different when you deal with criminal law or civil rights. It's in some ways 180 degrees different than how it's handled in the counties. So I've been obviously involved in defending people who've been prosecuted by the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office, and a very interested observer of the politics of the office. Seth, it's very sad. It was very sad to see what happened to him, because I think he did have an enormous promise. I think things had not gone the way they did. He'd have been a great candidate for statewide office. He's African. They thought that an African American from Philadelphia could run and win a statewide office.
He was the first African American DA in Philadelphia. Right?
That's correct, and
Yeah.
I think he would have made an enormously compelling candidate in a race for governor or senate. And it's sad to see what happened to him when what he was and what he was done in by, really, in my view. Was sort of corruption with a small c. I mean, it was like it was venality. It was the sort of the sins of his sort of personal appetites, or his inability to impose enough discipline on himself to stay out of the trouble he got into. I mean, his offenses, while they seem large because they were the crimes of a chief law enforcement officer, they're kind of petty, actually. I mean,
Right.
I found them to be relatively trivial, and they were all of the offenses, all of the stories, all had a context that fit into who he was and where he came from. They were not, I've forgotten the former treasurer's name. They're not the scenario where the former treasurer of Pennsylvania calling people and essentially soliciting donations in exchange for doing business. There was none of that was going on. All of the things that Seth got into involved people he had personal relationships with.
It was things like accepting gifts that he shouldn't have accepted and didn't declare. And
correct. And there was very little evidence, if any, that any of the people really benefited from. Did they attempt to gain favor, to benefit? Yeah, they probably did. It seems they did, but it doesn't look like he really followed through with anything. Nor do I think in his heart he had really had the heart to do it. So You know what? He was done in as people are through many people are through sort of his own personal demons, and not some bigger not through ambition. In other words, he wasn't reaching up. He was kind of reaching down, I guess. He wasn't looking for he wasn't trying to get to the next rung on the power ladder.
Through these acts, in other words.
Correct.
I mean, he had very strong political ambitions, but
Yes.
the crimes that he was
Right.
Accused of, and that ultimately he admitted responsibility for, were little. You say little. I mean, they're crimes, but they were not the crimes to get ahead. They were just.
And it's always magnified when it's a person who holds such a high level of public trust, of course.
Right.
But most of the corruption typically tends to be. I mean, with a government people, it's either you're really trying to profit in some substantial way, or you're doing favors, or you're trading something, trading some emolument of your office or whatever, to get an advantage
for somebody else.
Yeah, for someone else, or to get an advantage in your next election or your next, and that's just not what he was doing. So it was very sad to witness this. Quite honestly.
And he did accept gifts. I mean, he accepted a trip, overseas. He accepted a car. He used some campaign money for his own personal use, which you're not supposed to do, obviously. I mean, these are, as you point out, you're supposed to be beyond reproach. You can't be the enforcer of the law and you be someone yourself who's violating those laws. You can't have any credibility.
It's not forgivable. It's unforgivable, really.
Yeah.
But when you look at it in the big scheme of things, I think if you realize that this did not come out of some great ambition or some or some astonishing arrogance by him. It was, some personal appetites that he couldn't satisfy and took shortcuts to do that.
Right. I mean, it's fascinating to hear you describe your take on these, because what I hear in the description is almost a psychoanalysis of him, and not simply a recitation of the wrongs he committed. And I know in my own practice, I don't do criminal at all. I only do civil cases, but often we joke, that a lot of what we do is psychology. The psychology of presenting a story to a jury, or the psychology of understanding a client and where he or she has been, and how to work with that client, how to the psychology of negotiation or settling a case. I mean, there's so much of that. And by the way, none of that was ever taught to us in law school.
Correct.
Not a single day of law school was spent helping us understand that that's what we're getting into. But besides the obvious way that psychology or mental state plays in criminal law, everything from, what was the intentionality of the wrongdoer. I mean, you're also giving us something of a psychological profile of Seth Williams here, and how do you see that part of the story being significant to both his downfall and what's going to come ahead for him?
It's probably not. Obviously, it's not. Does not serve him as a defense or a legal excuse or a legal justification whatsoever. It's probably not even going to help him in very much in terms of seeking a lenient sentence. But whenever you see a public fall like this, at least from my standpoint, you ask why, it's interesting. I think from a political standpoint, people are looking to figure out who's going to replace him and what do they want in their elected leaders. It becomes important to try to have an understanding of to have some kind of understanding of who you're voting for, and are they vulnerable? Is this somebody who's going to be vulnerable to to abuse or corruption? Which sort of, I guess, would bring me to who is not quite the DA elect, but is most is clearly is essentially the next DA, who's Larry Krasner,
right?
Who, in my view, I don't know either Seth or Larry incredibly well personally. I've had the pleasure of meeting them both and spending some time with both of them. But um, interestingly, is Larry Krasner, in my view, probably could not be more different than Seth Williams in his personal,
Yeah.
sort of in his personal habits. I guess he's.
Well, before we get to him, before we get to the man who was very likely, almost certain to be the next DA, let's just finish the story of Seth Williams, right? So he is indicted. I think it's 28 counts or something like that, different things that he did, some of which we mentioned. He goes to trial in Philadelphia. I mean, and this is a spectacle for the district attorney to be on trial for corruption in federal court here in Philadelphia. And just finish the rest of the story as far as what happened, because it is tragic. I mean, and it's almost in an epic way tragic for someone in that position to end up, and as you were telling me earlier today, in solitary confinement. I mean, today our former DA is in solitary confinement, awaiting sentencing on October 24th. I mean, what's sort of just the rest of that story?
So
it's tragic.
What I read was that I believe he had an opportunity to engage in some sort of a negotiated plea agreement before the trial, and he rejected that. Went to trial, and then of course the government just piled on every conceivable offense they could think of. They charged him in a way that they could bring out every sin he's ever committed, at least, in the last, whatever, 7 or 8 years. And
the trial was not going well. You actually sat in and had a chance to see part of the trial,
Yeah, I
right?
sat through a little of the trial. It did not go well. I think the papers presented it fairly accurately. It was just a daily drumbeat of sort of, venal sins. Some of which were charged, some of which were not, because the government was allowed to bring in evidence of other things that happened that were not either criminal acts or were not brought as separate charges for whatever reason. But it was essentially one long trial of character assassination.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine what that must have felt like for him. But clearly at some point in the trial, he, I think, threw his hands up and realized that, he had no chance of winning.
Right.
And then it was a quick attempt at negotiating a plea, which was done. And sadly, the plea was accepted, and sadly the court, for reasons that no one can really explain to me other than it seemed basically punitive, that the judge then revoked Seth's bail, which meant that he was immediately incarcerated pending his sentencing. And as the DA of Philadelphia County, he's in a federal prison in Philadelphia County. Has to be, obviously he's an enormous target on his back. There's probably many people there who either had been prosecuted in the county or have relatives or know people, or at the very least, he's like a big trophy waiting, for someone to bang it, So he had to be put in solitary confinement, and which is
for his own protection.
Yeah, for his own protection, and
Right.
and that's really kind of tragic, because
Right.
there really is no reason. There really is no reason. He really didn't pose a flight risk, and there's it's very sad.
Well, we're going to turn the page and talk about Krasner, but just want to remind everybody who's listening that you are listening to our podcast, Good Law, Bad Law. I'm Aaron Freiwald, and I'm here with Alan Tauber, a criminal defense lawyer in Philadelphia. We're talking about the politics of the DA's office and the downfall, the tragic downfall of our just passed district attorney, Seth Williams, and the rise of an unlikely figure as the incoming district attorney. And Philadelphia politics is pretty interesting because Philadelphia obviously is a heavily Democratic city. If you win the Democratic primary, the Democratic nomination, you're going to win Philadelphia. It's been a rare exception to that rule over many decades of Philadelphia politics. So here comes Larry Krasner, who, as you say, couldn't be more different than Seth Williams. And he wins the Democratic primary for district attorney in May. There'll be a general election in the fall. But given the politics, the demographics politically of Philadelphia, he's almost certain to win that election.
7-1 Democrats versus Republicans, or something like that.
I mean, it's there's it's unlikely that there would be even any kind of real challenge to him, or anything anyone would consider a real challenge. So tell us a little bit about Larry Krasner. You say you've met him, you know him, and obviously you've observed the politics of criminal justice in Philadelphia for quite a few years. Who is this guy, and how did he get to where he is coming in?
Well, he is. He is as close as you come to the authentic progressive. Progressive lawyer, maybe even radical lawyer, to the extent that exists today. But Larry was a criminal defense lawyer, I think, his whole career, and a civil rights lawyer. He has, given of his time to represent, I think, in a pro bono way, to represent all manner of protest organizations and movements.
So groups like ACT UP, for instance.
Correct,
right?
ACT UP. I think Black Lives Matter. There are other, I think, maybe less formal groups. He was very active in defending protesters when the Republican National Convention was here in 2000, and also when the DNC, or the Democratic Convention, was here most recently
last year.
Yeah. So he's a long history of doing that, and endeared himself. I mean, if you're a progressive cause, you have a First Amendment issue, he'd be one of the people you'd come to see in Philadelphia. No question.
But if you look at the guy, he looks like he could be a bankruptcy attorney, or a corporate
Correct.
lawyer. He's got the gray hair, the short gray hair, the horn rimmed glasses.
He by my own estimation, he leads a life he could be his personal habits are like a Baptist minister. I mean, he lives a very conservative lifestyle from what I can tell, but has embraced the cause of civil rights, which is often is directly connected with libertarian values and libertarian principles, even though he may not personally engage in that kind of a lifestyle. So he is, as you said, a very unlikely person to become elected DA in Philadelphia, and it probably happened because of a whole perfect storm of political circumstances this year. But he brings the prospect of real reform to Philadelphia. And what's fascinating is that Philadelphia is the fifth largest city. He could do things in Philadelphia that could have national repercussions, because the size of our criminal justice system here means that if the things he does, he's
talking about doing,
if he actually follows through with them, and they prove to be successful in any way, in any measurable way, I would venture to guess that you would see it attempted to be replicated around the country, because what he's talking about doing is trying to reduce prison populations. He's trying to keep people out of jail. He's looking at the criminal justice system as the intersection of criminal justice and social justice, and will do many things with the hope that by changing the criminal justice system, it can sort of I don't know if it's not necessarily light a fire, but sort of be nurture social justice, the prospects of social justice around the community, within the community as well. So I would expect to see things like some of the lower level felony drug cases, drug distribution cases. I think he will probably try to find programs to give people a chance to avoid conviction, at least for a first offense. Avoiding a felony drug conviction is a fairly substantial, a fairly important credential. To avoid that, I mean, to have it is a fairly deadly credential. So, instead of just prosecuting these cases as they normally would be, and then giving someone someone develops a record and then has their prospects of finding work or getting further education are dimmed. That won't happen, and maybe they're less likely to continue in the criminal culture.
Well, let me try and understand this, because we'll talk about some other examples of this too. If you're the DA, you're the top prosecutor in the fifth largest city in the country. Explain the concept of prosecutorial discretion,
Okay.
and why a DA can make change, can really make systemic change, almost make cultural change, because he has discretion.
Sure. So the prosecutor has, as you say, discretion. Basically, he has the power to decide who to prosecute. So assuming that there's a crime's been committed, there's evidence, but whether to prosecute somebody, what charges to prosecute them under, what type of sentence to pursue, and then judges give a lot of weight to what the prosecutors ask for. They have discretion to set up programs that, as I just described, that could lead to a expungement of a record. So all of they hold a lot of power, and they have a lot of power to affect the fates of a lot of people who are charged with.
Well, let's give a specific, because we actually had on Steve Shane a week or so ago talking about marijuana law, and there's, of course, marijuana is a federal crime. It's on the Schedule I list, but there's essentially, as he was explaining, a policy at the federal level of non-prosecution. Many states are legalizing marijuana for varying uses, and the U.S. attorneys, federal prosecutors, guided by Justice Department policy out of Washington, could decide to prosecute a federal statute that is on the books, but they don't.
Right.
So here, it sounds like this is very similar in that way, that a prosecutor, new DA, could say, okay, there's lots of criminal statutes under Pennsylvania law and that we could prosecute here, but I'm going to de-emphasize prosecution of these crimes and emphasize prosecution of these crimes. So that's one type of discretion.
Right.
And so, and here again, we're talking about really marijuana, low level drug crimes that find a lot of people, not only with felony drug records, as you were saying, but also with jail time.
Correct. So that
would be a big change.
Yeah, that's a great example. I would expect that that Larry Krasner is not going to pursue marijuana prosecutions in any serious way. I mean, I would expect that's a perfect example of the type of the use of discretion. I think he's probably going to. Possession cases, I think probably won't even get prosecuted. I think unless there's violence or gangs or some other compelling reason, I think you're going to see a lot of distribution cases not being prosecuted or being diverted into some sort of alternative that won't lead to a conviction. At least for first-time offenders.
And again, that's not only to serve a goal of reducing, jail and prison populations, but also to affect some social policy.
Correct.
As we were talking about this before we started today, the idea of giving people another chance.
Right. So it's you're capturing people from going off of that ledge of having a record and all the negative implications that has. But also, just like any other office or like any other business, there's a finite amount of resources. What are we going to spend our time and money on? I think you're going to see and hear Larry talk about focusing on issues of violence, other priorities. He's going to try to take the resources that would be spent on some of these lower level drug cases and put them to places to make the community safer. There's a lot of arguments that can be made, about this, but there's that. I mean, there's he is a avowed opponent of the death penalty. Enormous amount of resources are spent prosecuting death penalty cases, and the appeals. Again, those are resources that are going to be able to be spent if he follows through on that. I have every reason to believe he will. He's a lifelong opponent of the death penalty and
campaigned on that.
And campaigned on it, which is no small bit of courage, as a future prosecutor to campaign on that. So, he doesn't know anybody. He campaigned on it and won. So I expect that the resources that went there could be applied elsewhere. Other initiatives that he may, other things he may do. He's long been a critic of the prosecutor's office and the city's failure to engage in police accountability. I expect that there's going to be. I don't know how he's going to do this. He has to. He has to maintain a working relationship with the police department. But I expect he's going to take some initiatives to try to make the police officers who appear in court and do the day-to-day work more accountable.
Well, I know there was just a story I heard on the radio the other day, a couple of days ago, that police who are accused of abuse or harassment and who go through an internal affairs review, that those reports are going to be much more accessible to the public. That currently, under the current policy, you can get access to that information, but you got to go out to the Internal Affairs Office in Northeast Philadelphia, and there's a whole process.
Correct.
And
that's correct.
Essentially, it's a hassle if you want to get it.
Try to put up roadblocks to that.
Yeah. Right, but just to be more transparent about the process as it is would, I think, also be a significant
I don't
change.
know if that's. I think that may be within the discretion of the police department. I'm not sure the prosecutor's office plays a role in that. But
that's
certainly
the kind of thing.
Oh yeah, and certainly he's in a position to advocate for it, which I think he would do. It'll be interesting. It'll be he's going to have to navigate some very this is going to be the politics of this are not going to be easy. I think there's a lot of people with a lot of vested interests in the way things are run now that are very apprehensive. And have a lot of anxiety about what may happen. But I think he will definitely want to throw open the curtains. I don't know him that well, but I've seen no reason why he's not going to follow through on what he campaigned on.
Well, and you have a relatively new governor, Tom Wolf. You have a relatively new mayor of Philadelphia. I mean, I don't know as much about the makeup of city council, but the political makeup in Pennsylvania, unlike a lot of states, around the country that seem to be going more red.
Yeah.
Pennsylvania seems like a state where a district attorney with this background, maybe to the left of a Bernie Sanders even, could see some of these changes, put into play. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see if they're reforms. We'll see if they make good change. That will remain to be seen. But it sounds like there are going to be changes.
Oh, there's no question. And what's interesting, just from a political standpoint, is like I said, if he has any success with this. Because you're dealing with this is one of the biggest criminal justice systems in the country, there's going to be a lot of interest in that, and I think you're going to see again if things do not explode on him, it would not surprise me to hear people talk about him for some other office. I mean, he's you're talking about someone who comes from very much comes from the left wing progressive world of politics. But he's punching his ticket as the law enforcement officer.
Right.
So you get to if he, I don't know what his ambitions are or where he'll be in 2 or 3 years, but he takes that the mantle of being the person most responsible for protecting the people of Philadelphia. He can take that around the state and say, look, I may have progressive politics, but I also have this very serious job, which I took seriously, and we've accomplished, a safer city. It's a very interesting kind of political, I guess, he'd be able to put together an interesting platform or an interesting campaign position from coming from there.
Well, if he's coming from the left, but he proves he's actually been tough on crime, he's been
Right.
effective in being tough on
Exactly.
crime, that would be a very interesting
Yeah.
package. You're right.
Right. So, and then who knows where the country will be after 2 or 3 years of a Trump presidency,
Right.
and the mood of the people, maybe, so it's, I don't know if he ever thought he'd find himself in this place. I think he's probably still pinching himself every day, but it could present he could end up being a very interesting political career.
Well, I'll tell you what we need to do. He takes office sometime end of the year. We need to have you back on this show a year from now.
Yes.
When we have had a few months of him as our DA, and then we'll see.
Sure.
It's going to have to figure out how to measure the impact of these changes, but we have to keep an eye on it very closely.
Yeah.
Alan, it's been great having you
Pleasure.
on. Tell everybody how they can reach you.
Okay.
Email, however you want to do it.
I'm at Lindy and Tauber is my firm. My email's atauber at lindyandtauber.com.
Tauber's how's that?
Tauber.com. That's probably the best way to reach me.
Good. Thank you so much. And absolutely, as you know, everybody who's been watching and listening to our show, you can find us, Good Law, Bad Law, now on YouTube, and also our audio podcast, the audio version of our podcast, you can get at iTunes. You can download all the past episodes as well. Also at Podbean, and of course also on our website at freewaldlaw.com. Also encourage everybody who looks at us, who checks out our YouTube videos, to like and subscribe. That way you get notifications. That's what we always say. And you can also follow Community Legal Advisors, which is our program to provide fixed rate, low cost wills and trusts and powers of attorney and that sort of thing. Get more information about that at our website as well, but also follow CLA on Instagram at CLA_Philly. Thank you, everybody, for listening, for watching, also on Periscope today. Alan, thanks again.
Pleasure to be here. Enjoyed it a lot.